Alberta has just placed 3 separate northern pipeline corridors on the table for formal evaluation. 1 million barrels per day, 3 competing paths through British Columbia, one hard deadline of July 1st, and a decision that will define where Canadian oil flows for the next half-century. Bloomberg's reporting from April 23rd revealed that Alberta is actively examining 3 route options for a new oil pipeline running through northern British Columbia. All 3 paths run north toward the Pacific coast, oriented toward Asian export markets, and deliberately away from the southern corridor that Ottawa has been quietly signaling it prefers. Alberta officials believe privately that the southern option would cost significantly more than any of the 3 northern alternatives. Provincial officials have not said that publicly, but the Bloomberg sourcing is clear and the directional thrust of the evaluation is unmistakable. This is not a routine procedural step. This is Alberta drawing a line in geographic and economic terms, and doing it with a July 1st submission deadline, bearing down on the country's energy planners like a freight train. Let us be precise about why this moment is different from every pipeline debate Canada has had before. The July 1st deadline for Alberta's submission to the Federal Major Projects Office lands on the exact same day as the CUSMA review deadline. That is the date on which Canada and the United States formally begin renegotiating the trade agreement that governs nearly $900 billion in annual bilateral commerce. Canada's primary negotiating leverage in that process is its energy sector. 4 million barrels of oil flow south across the border every single day. 10 of 12 NATO-designated critical minerals are Canadian. Natural gas from Western Canada heats American homes and powers American factories. The pipeline submission and the trade negotiation are not parallel tracks. They're the same track. What Alberta puts on paper by July 1st will shape what Canada can credibly threaten, offer, or withhold across the table from Washington. Now let us get into the geography, because that is where this debate actually lives. Alberta's oil sands are concentrated in the northeastern part of the province, centered around Fort McMurray. To reach Asian buyers in Japan, South Korea, China, and across the Indo-Pacific, that oil must cross the Rocky Mountains and reach the Pacific Ocean. The question that Alberta, Ottawa, and British Columbia are all fighting over right now is deceptively simple. Which way do you go to reach the water? The southern option, which federal signals and BC government statements both suggest Ottawa leans toward, would trace a corridor roughly parallel to the existing Trans Mountain pipeline. It would run south through the Rockies, pass through the Coquihalla region of BC, and arrive at the Port of Vancouver. That corridor has the advantage of existing regulatory familiarity. It has been permitted before. BC regulators know it, federal regulators know it, and BC Energy Minister Adrian Dix has been straightforward in saying that the southern route is BC's preferred outcome. But Alberta sees the south as a strategic and financial trap, not a shortcut. A person familiar with Alberta's internal deliberations told Bloomberg that there are long stretches along the Trans Mountain corridor where the terrain simply does not permit another large-diameter pipeline. The Coquihalla region is not an abstraction. It is one of the most geologically demanding mountain passages in the country. Trans Mountain itself, running through that zone, ended up costing well over $30 billion. The project saw budget overruns that became a cautionary tale for Canadian infrastructure planning. A parallel pipeline forced through the same rock faces, the same slope grades, the same river crossings, would confront the same cost pressures and would have no reason to produce a different outcome. The northern routes offer something the south cannot replicate: proximity to the buyer. Prince Rupert is 36 hours closer by sea to Shanghai than Vancouver is. That is not a marginal difference. Over 50 years of tanker operations across hundreds of voyages annually, a 36-hour shipping advantage translates into material savings for Asian refiners and better realized pricing for Canadian producers. A barrel of Alberta crude arriving at a South Korean refinery more cheaply and more quickly than competing barrels from the U.S. Gulf Coast is a barrel that commands a price premium. That premium, multiplied across 1 million barrels per day and 50 years of operations, is the economic case for going north. It is a case Alberta believes in, and it is a case that does not depend on political goodwill from anyone. So what are the 3 routes Alberta is actually evaluating? Bloomberg's reporting, drawn from people familiar with the evaluation who spoke on condition of anonymity, identifies 3 distinct coastal termination points. The first and most publicly discussed is Prince Rupert itself. Prince Rupert is BC's second largest port. It is home to the Ridley Island Energy Export Facility, which is currently under active development as a bulk commodity export terminal. That facility already has deep water access capable of handling large tankers. It already has the shortest sea route of any Canadian port to the markets of Northeast Asia. A pipeline connecting Alberta's oil sands directly to Ridley Island would tie into infrastructure that is already being built and already positioned for export at scale. The second and third termination points lie further north along the BC coastline. Their precise locations have not been publicly disclosed. They remain under technical review, but the directional signal is clear. The evaluation is looking at corridors that could reach the Portland Canal Zone near the BC-Alaska border or further into northwestern BC near the territories of the Nisga'a and neighboring First Nations. Routes terminating further north than Prince Rupert would reduce exposure to the difficult terrain constraints of the central BC interior, and in a warming Arctic, they could eventually access shorter Great Circle shipping lanes toward Asia. The trade-off is longer pipeline distance, higher capital cost, and more complex Indigenous consultation. That last point is not secondary, it is central. Terry Teegee, the regional chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations, was direct in his assessment when speaking to media. Whether the route runs north or south, he said, it traverses unceded and unsurrendered territory. Free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations communities is not a box to be checked at the end of a planning process. It is a constitutional and legal requirement that shapes whether a project can be built at all. This is where the history becomes essential context. The Northern Gateway Pipeline, which would have followed a northern BC corridor to the port of Kitimat, absorbed hundreds of millions of dollars in planning costs and years of regulatory review before being canceled in 2016. The project collapsed under the weight of insufficient Indigenous consent and a federal government decision to revoke its approval. Any northern route being evaluated today must be understood against that history. The proponents in the government know what happened. The communities know what happened. The question is whether the conditions have changed enough to produce a different result. And according to Teegee himself, they may have. He acknowledged that the geopolitical environment has shifted in ways that are causing First Nations communities to reconsider positions they held a decade ago. The conflict in the Middle East has driven energy price volatility that has real effects on Canadian household economies. The trade confrontation with the United States has focused Canadian attention on economic sovereignty in ways that resonate in Indigenous communities that have their own long history of asserting sovereignty. The model of Indigenous co-ownership that made the Trans Mountain acquisition politically survivable and that made the Cedar LNG project in BC viable is the framework that a credible northern route would need to adopt and demonstrate, not promise. Now let us talk directly about British Columbia's position because it is a genuine obstacle, not just a negotiating posture. Premier David Eby has described the pipeline project in terms that signal impatience with federal bandwidth allocation. BC views a major northern pipeline as an infrastructure undertaking that would consume the regulatory attention of both the provincial and federal governments for years at the expense of other priorities. BC Energy Minister Adrian Dix has been more pointed. He has stated publicly that the northern route is not realistic, that no one will underwrite it financially, and that if Ottawa is moving toward the southern corridor, BC considers that a constructive development. The legal mechanism behind BC's northern objection is Bill the 148, formerly the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act. That legislation passed in 2019 prohibits crude oil tankers carrying more than 12,500 metric tons from stopping at ports on BC's north coast. The moratorium boundary runs north of the southern tip of Haida Gwaii. Prince Rupert sits just below that boundary, which is a significant reason it is the anchor point for the northern evaluation. Any termination point further up the coast than Prince Rupert falls inside the moratorium zone. Getting oil onto a tanker at such a location would require either a legislative amendment to Bill the 148 or a novel legal interpretation carving out an exception for domestically produced Canadian oil moving to Canadian export terminals. Neither path is procedurally simple and neither is fast. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith has not publicly stated a preference for any single route. Her press secretary confirmed to CTV News that Alberta is leading a comprehensive evaluation of all viable corridors to ensure the eventual proposal is economically sound, environmentally defensible, and respectful of First Nations rights. That is the official position. The private position, according to Bloomberg sources, is that Smith and her advisors believe the northern routes offer a structural cost and logistics advantage over the south, and that the Trans Mountain parallel route would reproduce Trans Mountain's cost problems without Trans Mountain's existing regulatory runway. Let us now be direct about what remains unresolved, because the optimism in any Alberta submission has to be weighed against a set of genuine structural gaps. There is no private sector proponent. Trans Mountain had Kinder Morgan as its original builder and the federal government as its eventual owner. The proposed Northwest Oil Pipeline has neither. Alberta's government is acting as planning proponent for the purposes of the major project submission, but governments do not build pipelines. Companies that raise capital, issue bonds, manage contractors, and take on construction risk build pipelines. As of now, no company has publicly committed to building this project. Without a committed proponent, the capital markets cannot price the project, lenders cannot structure financing, and the economics remain theoretical. There is no confirmed cost estimate. A project of 1 million barrels per day capacity through northern BC terrain would be among the largest infrastructure undertakings in Canadian history. The routing evaluation underway is a necessary prerequisite to a cost estimate, but that estimate does not yet exist in public form. Without it, the economic case, however compelling in its directional logic, cannot be stress tested against the financial realities of construction. The tanker moratorium remains law. Bill the 148 has not been amended, suspended, or repealed. Any route north of Prince Rupert requires legislative action before a tanker could load. That is not a minor regulatory hurdle. It requires a government willing to put forward the amendment, a parliamentary majority to pass it, and a legal and political argument for why the moratorium's conservation rationale should yield to the economic and strategic rationale for the pipeline. And BC has not changed its fundamental position. A pipeline cannot be constructed through BC against the active opposition of the provincial government. Canada's constitutional framework does not permit Ottawa to override provincial jurisdiction on major infrastructure in the way that this project would require if BC maintains its objection. The federal government can invoke the national interest. It has done so before, but doing so against an unwilling province on a project of this scale would test the outer boundaries of that power in courts that would take years to resolve the question. All of that said, the Bloomberg reporting from April 23rd describes an Alberta government that is doing the analytical work with seriousness and speed. Running a genuine technical comparison of 3 route options in parallel rather than selecting a route and advocating for it politically is the correct methodology. It produces a submission that will be harder to dismiss as premature advocacy and easier to defend as a credible infrastructure planning document. The 68 days between now and July 1st are not a long time to resolve questions of this magnitude. Route selection, Indigenous engagement frameworks, preliminary cost modeling, environmental baseline assessments, and private sector interest mapping are not items that move quickly in normal Canadian infrastructure timelines. What the deadline does is force the conversation out of the realm of aspiration and into the realm of documented commitment. A credible July 1st submission says to Ottawa and to Washington, this is real, it is moving, and Canada does not need American routes to reach Asian markets. That matters enormously for what happens at the CUSMA table. Canada's energy leverage over the United States is not a rhetorical asset. It is a physical reality measured in barrels per day, pipeline capacity, and the absence of credible alternatives for American refiners in the short term. But leverage that is purely physical and has no strategic future attached to it is leverage that erodes. If Canada can point to a northern pipeline submission that represents a genuine alternative to dependence on the American market, the leverage becomes durable. If the submission is vague, the leverage is temporary. Alberta is placing a bet with a 68-day clock on the proposition that the North is cheaper, faster to Asia, and strategically superior to the South. The technical evaluation underway will either support that bet or complicate it. Either outcome is useful. What the country cannot afford in the current environment is another decade of the question remaining open. Alberta has put 3 northern routes on the table. The deadline is July 1st. The trade negotiation begins the same day. Canada's energy future and its negotiating position with the United States are, for the first time in a generation, being decided at the same moment. I am James Carter. This is Canada Current. Follow the flow, understand the power. If this gave you clarity on what is actually happening, hit like, share this with someone who needs to understand it, and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. We are back tomorrow.